I want to introduce our next speaker, Arne DeBoever, who has flown in from LA.
That's my greatest accomplishment.
Who has flown in from LA to honor us. And I'm very glad that he's come today for more than the usual reasons. I haven't seen him since before the pandemic, when the last time I think we had a chance to talk was sitting in a Holiday Inn restaurant, someplace like that, right? And talking over what looked like lunch. I'm not sure it was lunch, but it looked like lunch. As most of you here who are associated with the journal know Arne very well, those of you who don't, I will just say one or two quick things. He joined the Boundary 2 editorial board several years ago as one of our very ambitious and intelligent moves to expand the editorial group and to bring forward younger, earlier career thinkers whose engagement with matters that are continuous with those of the journal over a long period of time stood out to us. He has become an important writer and critic on problems of fiction and poetry, of translation, of aesthetics in general. He's perhaps best known for a book published in 2018 called Finance Fictions, although I recommend to you as well his writings in States of Exception in the Contemporary Novel, which is an earlier book, and a perhaps broader theoretical book called Against Aesthetic Exceptionalism. He is the editor and translator of many other documents and books. He's worked with Los Angeles Review of Books as well as with Boundary 2. And for Boundary 2, along with David Golumbia, who is here, and from whom you will hear soon, Arne has played a very substantial role in making B2O, the Boundary 2 online collective, an actually vibrant part of the internet intellectual community. He and David together have done this without anything like adequate support. I have mislaid your title. I'm sorry. It's right there. Yes, but I can't read screens. I need paper. I'm, after all, part of the old generation, so I find it. For those of you like me who cannot read screens, the title of this paper is Smears. So please join me in welcoming.
I think it was disappearing as Paul was saying it, so I'm hoping I can bring that back somehow. Great. My parents got married in 1972, which was the year Boundary 2 started. When Paul took over in 1988, I was 8 years old. And here we are now. If anyone would have explained to me back in 1988 what would be transpiring here now at Dartmouth, I wouldn't have been able to understand the word they were saying because I had zero English at the time. But as I said, here we are. I want to thank Dawn for making this possible. It's been impeccable in front of organization, so thank you so much for all the work you've put in. I want to thank Paul for having become a kind of mentor to me. I know not only to me, but several of the younger folks who've joined the collective and the masthead in recent years. I so appreciate your support and mentorship. Part of the reason I think why I'm here is because back in 2009, I defended a dissertation in front of a very critical committee. Two of the members of that committee are in the room here today. I remember being a graduate student sitting at the bar with one of my colleagues, another graduate student in the program, kind of banging my head on the counter, complaining about how critical these guys were about my writing, debating every little point and taking apart every single sentence. And then my colleague said, well, you should feel lucky because I'm not really getting much feedback from them at all. So at that point, I realized I was onto something good and I should try to hold on to it. So here we are today. This piece is called Smears. Never answer a critic. The motto the artist Neo Rauch put up in his studio as a reminder of his polemic with the critic Wolfgang Ulrich may well be the motto of a certain aesthetic autonomy. The idea that an artwork or artist should never answer their critics, and moreover, that they cannot be held accountable by them, and certainly are not responsible to them. Artworks and artists should not care about their critics. And one could argue, as Maggie Nelson does in a chapter titled Art Song in her book On Freedom, 4 Songs of Care and Constraint, that this is precisely why the critics should care about artworks and artists, because they assert themselves in that not caring as figures of freedom that, as such, surely deserve our care, even if they may hurt us occasionally. Strangely, the word autonomy and the notion of aesthetic autonomy never appear in Nelson's chapter, which nevertheless seeks to maintain some aesthetic freedom in a contemporary cultural moment when, as she notes, freedom is being captured by the right wing with renewed intensity. This capture is, of course, not new. Meanwhile, the so-called left is being cast, rightly or wrongly, in the repressive, punitive position. She writes, the reference here is to the cancel culture of the woke mob, as the right might put it. By and large, I agree with Nelson's project, and I see the urgency of arguing for aesthetic freedom, especially today. What frustrates me about her discussion of aesthetic freedom, however, is that it mentions, but does not think through, its capture by the right. All Nelson's book offers on this count are a few superficial references, whereas what seems needed in the conversation about art and freedom today is precisely an in-depth consideration of this capture and how it has affected the left-right distinction that structures in a rather reductive way the US concept of the political. This is needed, I want to argue, not only to carefully assess the positions of critics who are intervening in this field, myself included, and I make a brief but rather dubious reference in Nelson's book, to which, in defiance of the advice quoted earlier on, I intend to respond. But moreover, to prevent the argument for aesthetic freedom from becoming right-wing, something that an argument for not caring, for no accountability and no responsibility in art can easily become. Those issues become pressing, all the more pressing, when the art under consideration is or is perceived to be political art. They matter, I want to argue, even when the art is or is claimed to be apolitical, but the artist intervenes politically in the public sphere, exercising their free speech, which is surely another element in this overall conversation. It would have been helpful to see Nelson articulate the differences between aesthetic freedom and free speech in this context. In other words, I will try in part to answer here one of my critics, a critic who also happens to be a former colleague and remains a friend, and one for whose critical thinking and writing I am grateful. I'm not certain that artists should never answer their critics, and it doesn't seem to me that Nelson is certain about that either. She praises in her book how Catherine Opie, in a class run by Opie at UCLA, kindly hectors a student whose work has just been criticized for signifying the backbone of colonialism. And so Opie goes, "Stand up for your work. Open it up. Don't shut it down, man." In other words, answer your critics. The standing up that's recommended here surely cannot just be a blank argument for aesthetic freedom. Don't expect me to care about your charge of colonialism. I am not accountable to you. I don't need to respond to that. Presumably, to stand up for one's work would mean to take account of the criticism, be responsible to it, respond to it, and in a way care about it, with the understanding that doing so wouldn't just lead to one's being cancelled. This is a view of the artist who does respond to the critic, and of a critique that is not just about the sovereign thumb up or down, I let you live or you die. Aesthetic freedom, then, in the autonomy it asserts, is not beyond criticism and critique. Its freedom may precisely lie in being criticized and standing up to that criticism in a culture of critical debate that in other, less difficult understandings of freedom would fall by the wayside. The fact that aesthetic freedom is not beyond criticism and critique is not a contradiction in Nelson's position. As I see it, Nelson's argument would be for an aesthetic freedom that asserts its autonomy while standing up to its critics and savoring the conversation that comes out of that. But this is an argument that the reader needs to craft, to synthesize from Nelson's book, which more typically oscillates between art and critics shouldn't care, going back to her work in The Art of Cruelty, and a recommendation for artists to defend their work against its critics, the Opie anecdote, which is central to On Freedom. The fact that these days the argument for aesthetic freedom, in close relation to the argument for free speech, is made most loudly by the right, is what really casts the biggest shadow over unfreedom, one that Nelson acknowledges but never confronts. Her hope seems to be instead that simply asserting aesthetic freedom as separate from the right will do the trick. But such an assertion, even if it comes from an authority like Nelson, ultimately cannot convince because it is precisely a mere assertion. It needs an engagement with the right and the political situation today to be able to hold any of the ground it claims. This, On Freedom, does not provide. Never answer a critic. I borrow the motto, as I indicated, from Neo Rauch, who put it up in his studio after his debate with the critic Wolfgang Ulrich. At the center of this debate is Rauch's painting Der Ambroiner from 2019, shown here at its auction. The proceeds of the work's sale went to a children's hospital. The work was reportedly bought by a Trump admirer. The painting is thought to show Ulrich. I hope people can see that here. I'll describe it as well. His initials, W.U., are on the canvas on the right, with his pants down, the warts on his butt clearly visible. He is shown in the act of painting with his own fresh feces, a badly executed mustachioed figure doing the Nazi salute, perhaps an acclaim of the Hitler lookalike who's peeping through the window in the back of what seems like a cramped attic studio, in which a three-legged, why three-legged, Ulrich, if it is indeed Ulrich, is at work. A hammer appears to have fallen on one of his 3 feet into a bucket of feces. There is an odd shadow in the back that has confused the critics. Much has been written about the triangular figures in the ceiling, especially the faintly glowing blue one on the left, which may or may not carry symbolic cosmic significance. If the painting is supposed to answer the critic, the fact that the answer comes in the form of a painting adds to the ambiguities. As Ulrich, in his book about Rauch's painting, and the debate it triggered, has discussed, Der Ambroiner was Rauch's response, sent as a reader's letter to the German newspaper Die Zeit, to an op-ed by Ulrich in which the critic speculated about how the argument for aesthetic autonomy is becoming an argument from the political right. Ulrich writes of a Rechtsverschiebung der Idee autonomer Kunst, a shift towards the right of the idea of autonomous art. This book hasn't been translated yet, by the way, so all the translations here are mine. As such, the weapon of aesthetic autonomy is wielded against the feminist, post- and decolonial, in short, woke culture, and in some instances cancel culture of the left, and its ever more frequent accusations of fascism. The painting's title, Der Ambroiner, refers to someone who accuses another of fascism, literally makes them look brown, and even more literally, smears them with shit. In his discussion of the painting's title, Ulrich refers to the rightist online magazine PI News, short for Politically Incorrect News, where an anonymous writer proposes the hypothesis that it's because there are fewer and fewer real Nazis around that the left needs to invent new Nazis and engage in smear campaigns. It's worth noting in this context that Ulrich is hardly a representative of the woke left. He recalls at some point in his book how women students walked out of one of his public lectures in protest against an older white man's discussion of aesthetic autonomy. Not so much Rauch's art, but his statements about artists and art revealed, Ulrich had suggested in his op-ed, some rightist motifs that furthermore enabled Ulrich, who is based in Leipzig, former Eastern Germany today, but is from the West. Rauch, an icon of the new Leipzig school, is an Aussie, to situate Rauch's discourse in a historical split between East and West, in which the autonomy argument has changed sides and also politics. Colonialism and decolonization are caught up in that shift. Ulrich insightfully documents in his book how anti-colonial arguments for decolonization have gained ground within East German and beyond that alt-right that perceives itself to be colonized by the West and, for example, its policies on immigration or its general stance towards multiculturalism. This is a phenomenon that can be found elsewhere in Europe as well. As the brilliant critic Olivia C. Harrison has shown in her work, she has an article forthcoming in Boundary 2 that relates to this. As Olivia C. Harrison has shown in her work on the history of anti-racism in France, one can find the same phenomenon there in the work of Renaud Camus, inventor of the Great Replacement theory, who has claimed anti-colonial struggles as a major inspiration for his conspiracy about how white people in Europe are being replaced by, read, colonized by, people of color. His rightist answer to that is to decolonize. Okay, people are understanding the way these terms are being used here. It's a little counterintuitive, but that's what's going on. Yeah? The resentment that fuels those kind of theories and appropriations of anti-colonial and decolonial thought is perhaps captured in Rauch's painting itself. With the hammer in the bottom right corner of the painting, I should maybe go back to that. With the hammer in the bottom right corner of the painting, resembling an upside down letter T that appears to have fallen off the canvas. With the W and the U in the painting, it spells the German word Wut, anger. Anger against the colonization by the West, its immigration policies, its multiculturalism, which are perceived as a colonization of the autonomy of the recently liberated East that is now facing oppression once again. Urich had not called Rauch a fascist, however. He had merely written about some rightist motifs in Rauch's discourse. For example, Rauch's nostalgic wish to, quote, turn back time, preferably to the Romantic era, where he recognizes his own origin, end quote, and when, quote, from a formal aesthetic point of view, everything was still better ordered, end quote. Rauch's accusation that Urich had called him a fascist, and moreover that he was tired of critics finding politics in art, seemed off the mark, especially also because Urich had not written about Rauch's paintings, merely about his discourse, what he was saying in the public sphere as an artist. Rauch's paintings are, by the way, not explicitly political. Still, and as Ulrich's book about the case, titled Feindbild werden, becoming the image of the enemy, translated in a short New York Times piece about the case as becoming a boogeyman, showed, Rauch's painting turns the critic with his perceived accusations of fascism into the image of the enemy, who smears the autonomous artist and curtails their freedom. As Rauch sees it, Urich is writing against artistic freedom, even if Urich has elsewhere, and even in a court case where a performance artist was on trial for making the Hitler salute in his art, argued for it. The artist, Urich argued, was not making the salute out of political conviction, but to make the point that the gesture itself was not animated with politics in some magical way. As such, the artist making the gesture as part of his art falls under artistic freedom, which is distinguished in German law from freedom of speech, a key value of today's right. However, Ulrich was not analyzing Rauch's art, but what Rauch has said about the artist, art, and about art critics, which is a different matter. Rauch asserts his autonomy on that front as well, but while expecting a kind of majesty-like deference to him as a dissident or genius, these are all terms from Ulrich's book, and this Ulrich is not willing to grant. Ulrich points out that after Rauch's work was auctioned on behalf of a children's hospital, something I mentioned before, some considered Ulrich a kind of majesty offender, quote, as if it were taboo or even blasphemous to criticize an artist because of a few interviews. As a critic, however, Ulrich operates from, quote, an egalitarian position that does not grant artists late or neo-absolutist special rights, end quote. With respect to Rauch and other artists from the former GDR, he suggests that their continued belief, even after postmodernism, in, quote, a special authority of the artist figure, a validity of art outside of time, dates from the days when they had to pledge allegiance to an authoritarian state, whether they wanted to or not, end quote. Now, in Rauch's discourse, it's the artist and art that demand this kind of allegiance, And paradoxically, such a position for aesthetic autonomy is then played out against the critic, who gets cast as, quote, a characterless and even fanatical functionary of a power machine that with a few words can annihilate entire existences, end quote, with artists experiencing themselves as victims and martyrs in that kind of situation. In other words, for Rauch, it's the critic who becomes the authoritarian representative of the state, whereas as Urich sees it, it's the exceptionalist artist claiming a majesty-like position who is in fact aligned with the authoritarian state. Both are no doubt exaggerations, as Urich would be the first to criticize. That's Renaud Camus. Never answer a critic. I lay out some aspects of the Urich-Rauch debate, in part because of, the words are very close, it's just the T that's different. The Urich-Rauch debate, in part because of their resonances with how, in her book on freedom, Nelson briefly references my own work. I apologize for the focus on my own work, but as I said, I'm kind of settling a friendly score here, so, I have to get back to the text. So, resonances with how, in her book on freedom, Nelson briefly references my own work, specifically my discussion of Sam Durant's work Scaffold in my short polemical book against aesthetic exceptionalism, which Paul mentions before, my book, which criticizes precisely the majesty-like treatment of artists and art from the point of view of political theory, specifically theories of sovereignty and democracy. Nelson offers my reading of Durant's work, a gallows built on the 1-to-1 scale that was modeled after an immense gallows that had been used in the mid-19th century to put 38 Dakota men to death in Mankato, Minnesota, as an example of, quote, arguments that recur in attempt to curtail the space for art, end quote. This is because, as per Nelson's reading, my take on Scaffold, quote, pushes past the imperative to politicize art and aims toward eliminating the art part entirely and treating it as having power analogous to, or even precisely of, a militarized state, end quote. This is what Nelson writes. Nelson refers to my contention that, quote, Durant's Scaffold didn't just echo or evoke the violent power of sovereignty, but rather, I wrote, reinstated that power precisely, end quote. Nelson quoting me. Nelson appears on the scene as the savior of art's freedom against critics who would seek to curtail it. This is a charge that I don't take lightly, given that for the past 13 years, I have been teaching young artists and critics in my undergraduate and graduate classes. You'd have to ask them. Some have in fact been in touch after the publication of Nelson's book, but I don't think they would recognize my approach to their work in Nelson's characterization. That is because the above scene in which Maggie Nelson saves non-fascist art from the fascist critic is one of Nelson's own imagination. Anyone who can read and has access to the internet can check the record. My book is freely available to all. What I wrote was that with the, quote, grand critical artistic gesture, end quote, of building a gallows on the 1-to-1 scale, Durand, quote, seemed, she drops that word, seemed to reinstate precisely, presumably against his own intention, the violent power of sovereignty, this time in the form of art. And because it was art, Durand thought, surely everyone would realize that it was outside of the problematic of sovereignty that it sought to contest, end quote. I continue in the next paragraph, quote, while political sovereignty and sovereignty in the form of art are of course different, this was nevertheless proven to be a naive assumption. What happened to Durand's work, all the protests it evoked, I'm sure many of you are familiar with the case, laid bare, beyond this obvious difference, art's imbrication in and even complicity with sovereignty. It exposes, furthermore, that the idea that art somehow exists separately from the problems of sovereignty that Durand wanted to contest is itself a sovereign illusion that repeats the very problems it seeks to contest, end quote. My chapter then goes on to discuss how it was the Native American protests against the sculpture that laid bare this issue. My point was that political art is never free from politics and should reflect carefully on its operations. It's true that within that framework, I considered the complicity of what I call aesthetic exceptionalism, the discourse that presents artists and works of art as exceptional, and political exceptionalism, as it was developed in the work of the German legal scholar and convinced Nazi, as Hannah Arendt referred to him, Carl Schmitt, specifically in Schmitt's book Political Theology, 4 chapters on sovereignty. Urich notes the connection, by the way, of religious and political motifs in his book on Rauch. But hinting at such complicity is not the same as identifying aesthetic exceptionalism with political exceptionalism. In the block quote above that I gave you, I precisely acknowledge their difference. It is, rather, Nelson who, in my view, enters into treacherous territory by allowing that difference to be absolute, as if there can be no way in which a work like Scaffold can reinstate the violence it criticizes. In a discussion about Scaffold, which was initially shown in Germany and well received there, I heard Durand say that the piece was possibly received differently in Germany because the country's memorial culture is more evolved than in the US. But I wonder, I didn't ask him this in that public conversation which happened at CalArts with a lot of students who were very upset by this work, but I wonder how a gas chamber rebuilt on the 1-to-1 scale would have gone over in Germany. It's not because Germany's memorial culture was more evolved that Durand's work was well received there. It's because the particular trauma of Scaffold was not Germany's trauma. It was not legible in that context, whereas obviously it was at the Walker Art Center in Minneapolis, where Scaffold was first shown in the United States. It's difficult to see how anyone could find in the above quotations from my work a claim about art having the power of, quote, a militarized state, end quote. That is not my claim. Moreover, it is not my language. I do not use the words militarized state. One has to wonder also whether, if Nelson thinks I'm the boogeyman here, she doesn't also think the same, whether she acknowledges it or not, the Native Americans protesting Durand's work, because it's that protest that informed my own position. One could hardly accuse them, I think, of being on the side of the militarized state. Apart from the fact that the equation and in Nelson's sense identification between art and the state can simply not be found in my book, Nelson has to drop the copula seam from the sentence she quotes to land the charge of equation. Andrea Long Chu has pointed out in a perceptive review of Nelson's book that Nelson is making an equation here that quite simply does not hold up. Nelson criticizes me for supposedly equating art to the state, an equation that again cannot be found in my book. But in her doing so, she is in fact equating the critic to the state, leading Chu to ask, quote, who's calling who the state now? End quote. Even if it were true, isn't this a gross exaggeration? And what's the use of such accusations if they clearly miss the mark? Art is clearly not the state. The critic clearly isn't either, even if both may, on occasion, be complicit with the state. Nelson's final assessment of Scaffold, she, quote, read the story of Durand's engagement with the Dakota as a painful but ultimately rousing tale of the possibilities of protest, dialogue, and resolution, end quote, is actually very close to my own. I ended my chapter on Scaffold by pointing out how it can help us navigate the complexities of debates about sovereignty today. In short, we both praised the democratic culture that was obviously at work in the story of Scaffold. Never answer a critic. With Chu's question about my brief appearance in Nelson's book, Who's Calling Who the State Now?, we have, in the context of this response, returned to the debate between Urich, the critic, and Rauch, the painter, which is played out in Nelson's book, except that here I am the critic, and although Nelson is a critic as well, she comes in to save the artist and art, defending their autonomy against what she perceives to be my authoritarian criticism. I supposedly equate art to the militarized state. Of course, my own point about Durand's work was precisely that in its reproduction of an instrument of sovereign power on the 1-to-1 scale, it could not comfortably assume to be on the right side of history. It had to anticipate the negative reception that, in Minneapolis, it received, a reception that indicated that, at least in its appearance, the work seemed to be on the side of the state. That is why Native Americans protested against it. That is also, moreover, why the work became a cause of the right, who resisted what they perceived as the work's censorship, its cancellation by the woke left, and in the case of white supremacy groups, could even claim the work as monumentalizing their violent heritage. Nelson is accusing me of smearing the artist and art with fascism. But the case for aesthetic autonomy, and aesthetic autonomy was very much the issue with this work, can be made by the political right here, revealing the same rightwards shift of the autonomy argument that Urich is acknowledging in Germany. Importantly, this does not cover the full spectrum of possible positions. One can also be on the political left and make the case for aesthetic autonomy, as presumably Nelson is doing. This used to be, in fact, the default political position of the argument for aesthetic autonomy. But I don't think one can do so still today without acknowledging the complexity of the issue, i.e. without questioning the assumption that aesthetic autonomy is an argument of the left. A book on freedom and art needs to engage this problem in depth to be convincing. Now, unlike Rauch's work, which again was not commented on by Ulrich, Durand's work is political art, and we find a useful reconfiguration here of the elements of the Ulrich-Rauch debate. Whereas Ulrich was not looking at Rauch's art, but only at his discourse about artists and art, you'll remember, a discourse that revealed rightist motifs, I was only looking at Durand's work, and not at Durand's discourse about artists and art, which in fact reveals leftist motifs. Durand has long made works about race in the US, and it's clear where he stands on this front. He's a colleague of mine at CalArts. Maggie used to be as well, so this is kind of an internal score that's being settled here also. So, whereas with Ulrich and Rauch, the rightward shift is found in a discourse about the autonomy of art, in the case of Durand, it's the artwork itself that turned out to be at risk of a rightward shift, in spite of the leftist motifs in the artist's discourse. In my point that political art is never free from politics and should reflect carefully on its operations, it is possible to read, as Nelson does, a claim for the curtailing of the space of art. Specifically, this is a point that reconsiders art's autonomy in order to say that political art does not stand separately from politics and bears responsibility in that realm. Against this position, which Nelson equates to, identifies with the position of the militarized state, Nelson, art's savior in her own narrative, is making the argument for art's autonomy, its freedom. But the problem here, which is a problem that Ulrich forces us to recognize, is that this precise argument is in the process of shifting rightwards. That is what I've tried to consider in my work on aesthetic exceptionalism and its resonance with political exceptionalism as it is articulated in the work of Carl Schmitt. This does not mean, as I have been careful to point out, that all exceptionalisms are fascist. I have suggested that there are communist exceptionalisms in the work of Alain Badiou, for example, and democratic ones in the works of Jacques Rancière and Bonnie Honig. So I'm not throwing around the accusation of fascism. I am not participating in such a smear campaign. Certainly, I've never written or said that Durand is a fascist, that his work is fascistic, or that he should not have the freedom to make a work like Scaffold. I think the same about Dana Schutz and the open casket issue. I think the same about Philip Guston, who came up yesterday in a conversation between Charles and Paul that was redacted and read to us. I think all these folks have the freedom to do as artists whatever they want, but they need to be ready to stand up for their work when the questions come, you know. My only point has been that political art, when it comes to aesthetic autonomy, never operates separately from political reality and ought to carefully consider its politics. To respond to that by arguing for aesthetic freedom and without carefully engaging the rightward shift that this argument has experienced in recent years is to expose oneself to the risk of playing into that very rightward shift. Thanks for your attention. Sorry. Yes, I don't know who was first. Let's go to you first.
Well, it's a very interesting paper, but what happened to Sam Durand's piece? It was taken apart and...
Correct, yes.
I think you need to account for that in your talk.
Yes. You know, we can talk about that a little bit. So part of what Maggie's referring to when she's talking about, you know, resolution that was arrived at is that so, you know, Sam, because the piece was installed at the Walker Art Center without any communication with Native American communities around there,
It
right?
was taken apart
That's
and
right,
given
yes.
to the
So,
Native American community.
Yes, so copyright to the work was ceded to the Native American community. the materials of the work was taken apart, were given to the community. At first there was a plan to burn those materials, but I think because of the significance of fire in the tribe, the fact that once you light a fire, you can never really extinguish it. Ultimately, the materials were buried at an undisclosed location.
Yeah, I think that's very important to your overall point, because the criticism of the Native Americans of that piece and the ultimate resolution of the piece, the taking apart, the burying of it, becomes part of the piece to me.
Absolutely, yeah, but this was also a question that the students were asking, because even through that process, people felt, because Sam was then still accounting, you know, giving artist stocks or he was talking, and students were like, yeah, but you're still making this part of your success as an artist, and this is a very, you know, in a way, they were asking him to stop talking about this piece entirely. I mean, the burial moment is particularly interesting because I didn't mention this. The tribe had not been allowed to bury these 38 men. You know, when they had been hanged. So it was a sort of Antigone moment where the burial happened. You know, it was not allowed at the time, and then kind of did end up happening later. So.
The other point is that you said that the artists should reply to the critics, but what about the dead artists? I mean, Guston's dead, and
yeah, but in this case, we're talking about the museum directors and the gallerists.
well,
I feel
he lost
people
his,
should
the main curator lost his job at the Tate because he protested against Guston's show coming down.
Yeah, but I think that's wrong.
I'm agreeing that it's wrong. I'm just saying that if you say that the dead artists should reply, what do you do in cases like we saw in London where Hogarth's work is under attack in the captions to the Hogarth show by people who weren't alive when Hogarth did the work? In other words, I'm just saying historically you're getting into like some hot water here.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not saying the dead artist should reply. I'm saying the museum director should reply. I'm also not thinking or assuming that if you reply, you're going to win the debate. I mean, you might still get canceled, you know.
Yeah.
I mean, my God, if we don't reply, what are we going to do?
No, I'm totally in favor of replying.
Again, it might not go the way you want to go, but what else are you going to do? Keep quiet?
It's just such a fraught topic right now.
I know it's a front topic, yeah. Absolutely, yes.
Thanks for that furious presentation. I really liked it. I have one question about this distinction between the artist and the critic. I mean, isn't that a very old problematic that artists often feel misused, pigeonholed? And I mean, Maggie Nelson is
she's an artist and a critic at the same time.
Critic.
Absolutely,
she has a PhD, right? She can do basically both games. But if you think of that Susan Sontag essay against interpretation, where she invokes...
Which she actually teaches right now. We had her over at Kellogg's and she's teaching that.
Sorry, who's teaching?
Maggie.
Yeah.
Yes.
No, but
Susan can.
Susan Sontag.
No. Maggie is teaching Susan.
No.
Yeah. Okay, but if you think of that essay that asks us to imagine the scene of the work, some minimalist slab, and then the critics comes along and says, what does it mean? Which is a way of basically casting the artwork in a specific conceptual net that maybe the artist has no interest in, right? So I'm just thinking about this old problem that artists, that Planet PhD and Planet MFA often have very different sensibilities.
Yeah.
And isn't that phrase not to want to answer the critic and actually having the feeling that the critic is also using him for a certain kind of game that critics do. I'm just wondering whether this would also be a resonance and maybe also between Maggie Nelson and you.
Yes, so I agree with everything you're saying with breaking down the distinction. In the case of Rauch, the situation is interesting because when Ulrich spoke about, I said that multiple times in the talk, when Ulrich spoke about these rightist motifs, he was not talking about Rauch's art at all. He was only commenting about how Rauch had talked about art and artists in the public sphere. So interviews with him, newspaper, or else. He had said certain things about what he thinks about the artist, the figure of the artist, what is an artwork, and so on and so forth. And so Ulrich said, the way you're talking about artists and art, genius, majesty-like, and so on and so forth, granting them a certain kind of exceptionalist status, is kind of fascistic. I mean, we don't need to bring in that deference to, he didn't say fascistic, he said rightist motifs, but we don't need to bring in that kind of deference to the artist. Yeah? I want to treat everyone in the same way. The artist is not more privileged when they intervene in the public sphere than the critic or anybody else for that matter who speaks up, right? So it wasn't so much about Rauch as an artist in terms of the artistic works he was putting out. It was precisely about Rauch in a way as a critic or somebody who has thoughts about what is an artist or what is a work of art. And so Urich was engaging that. And then the debate became about how Urich Rauch was claiming certain privileges as somebody who exercises speech in the public sphere that are similar to the privileges he claims as an artist. An artist should be able to do whatever they want. But I think if you speak up in the public sphere and you put your opinions out there, you're going to be held accountable in a different way than if, as an artist, you put a work out there. Partly because works are so much more ambiguous than statements that you're making in the public sphere. So that was kind of what that whole thing revolved around. And then Rauch turned that into something very strange by saying, never answer a critic. I mean, he wasn't being interpolated as an artist about the politics in his work. That wasn't really what it was about. He then answers the critic with a painting, which confuses things also because the painting is so much more ambiguous. So what is he trying to say? Is it even Urich who's being shown? So in a way, a lot of the confusions in that debate revolve precisely around that distinction and the borderline between these two figures, which is not, personally a borderline that I adhere to. I mean, I would again just say engage and then respond, and that's the culture of critique, in which I think both artists, when they're putting artworks out there, and critics, obviously, when they're talking about works of art, participate. One thing that I would say, and this came out of a conversation I had with Maggie about this, is again, we take walks together. When my first kid was born, she had her kid, and my wife was breastfeeding with her. And, we have like really long-standing, close friendship. Maggie was saying maybe it's a question of distinguishing between the moment of artistic creation, where we feel artists should be able to do whatever they want, and then once the work gets out, you have to be ready to stand up for it. But at the moment when you're making, you should not worry about the critics, you should not worry about politics, you should just do whatever you want.
But you're not in the same conceptual space, right? I mean, if you're an artist, and then you try to formulate with words about what you do and using your own concept, and then a scholastic person who has studied medieval Latin, for example, comes and says, "No, this is my space." It's just a way of deciding that the public space in which we talk about art happens to be Ulrich's space rather than something else.
I know.
And
that's what novelists, for example, will say, "I'm not talking about my work, right? The work is the work. Whatever questions you have of it, if the work is good, it should answer them, right? And so I'm not speaking." So that's a position too, and maybe it's closer to never answer the critic, just never even say anything. The work is a work and that's it, right? So some people take that position. Rauch is clearly not someone who takes that position. He has said certain things, and so then he gets interpolated on those, right?
This is a really fascinating discussion. Are you presupposing a public sphere that can do justice to the debate that you're elaborating upon as one of the presuppositions for the presentation of the case?
It's a radical question, foundational.
And I'm wondering if that mise en scène has, in the elaboration of the difference in the debate, the assumption of what organizes the public sphere has already been disallowed as a grounding assumption, because the public sphere would presuppose that the debating partners all agree to conditions of deliberative thinking that would enable debate. But if the way in which you describe the terms of the debate indicates that the key term to be done justice to, aesthetic autonomy and its relation to freedom, has always already been violated by either a rightward turn or a wrong turn on the left. It seems that the conditions for arriving at what would pass as the coming to terms with the question in the public sphere has already been presupposed as impossible in the very description of the litigants.
That's a very Rancierian question. I mean, I wasn't in the presentation, even though I'm arguing for or assuming a public sphere in which the kind of debate between the critic and the artist, Ulrich in this case, and Rauch, would be allowed to happen. I'm not assuming that their deliberations would lead to a kind of consensus where, you know, they all get along. And so, you know, I'm assuming that there could be some kind of confrontation, especially if the artist is not an artist who says, I never say anything in the public sphere, right? I'm just quiet, I make my works, and my works are my works. That said, one of the things I often tell my students, and this goes to what you are asking about, I think, Dawn, is that I tell them very often, remember that you're an artist. You're not me. I mean, I'm a critic. You're an artist. So you can do stuff in your work that's different from what I can do in my work. So the paradigm in which you're working, the frame in which you're working, if it is a paradigm or frame at all, you're not held accountable by the same logics or, you know, rules that I am. You know, that doesn't mean when your stuff gets out there that I'm not going to bring everything I have to it and criticize you. You know, I'll have a critique, and your colleagues will ask things, and it's true that students, you know, are like, well, I don't know exactly what's going on. I see what you're saying, but why did I do that? I don't really know. But having that critique moment then helps them, I think, to develop the discourse that OP points out in the UCLA class. It helps them to stand up for their stuff, so that when a critique comes, well, what about colonial? What about gender? They actually have a narrative prepared. Crucially, that's not the narrative, I think, that they start out with. Right? I mean, they're doing something else, and then that stuff gets thrown at it. And I always feel what they're actually doing, this is, I think, why it's also so important that they have the freedom to do whatever they want to do. I always feel it's one step ahead. So this is one thing I have as a critic, I feel I'm always coming behind, right? No matter how many times I've seen the thing and how old the thing is, and it always feels like it stays a step ahead, even when I've read it, 20, 30, 40 times, it stays a step ahead. And that's, I think, because it's just operating in a different way. So I think in a way you're right, there remains a kind of difference, I think, between those two realms, art and the realm of the critic. At the same time, right, I don't think that means they can't meet.
I can see you're a terrific teacher.
Sorry?
I say I can see you're a terrific teacher. I mean that sincerely.
You have to ask the student right there.
Thank you, Arne, very much.
All right, thank you, everyone.